What is going on, guys? Welcome back. In this video today we're going to learn how to send post requests using beacons in JavaScript to our web application in order to keep track of analytics. So let us get right into it. Alright, so we're going to learn how to keep track of analytics in our web applications today. And in particular, we're going to implement a time tracking feature for a Flask application, meaning we're going to keep track of how much time individual users spend on individual endpoints. And this can then be used for all sorts of statistics and analytics to figure out which is the most important endpoint, for example. And the basic idea is that we're going to have a Flask backend. So we're going to have different endpoints and we're going to have a time tracking endpoint as well. So we're going to send requests to this endpoint to log the time that a user spends on an endpoint, and the actual tracking, the actual measurement will happen on the client side in the front end, so in the JavaScript code. And we're going to send post requests to the backend using so-called beacons. Beacons are basically asynchronous post requests, you can say, that transmit a small amount of information, mainly used for analytics. And we're going to just measure the time spent on an endpoint. And when we leave that endpoint, when we unload the page, we're going to send a request, a small beacon to the backend. And we don't have to submit a form for this. We don't have to do anything actively. This is just going to asynchronously send a beacon to the backend. That's the basic idea. Now for this video, you're going to need to have Flask installed. So open up the terminal and install Flask using pip if you don't have it yet. So pip install Flask or pip3 install Flask. And then we're going to start by opening a new Python file, app.py. And I think we're actually also going to need pandas. So install pandas as well, because we're going to keep track of the information in a CSV file. Alternatively, of course, you can also keep track of the information in a database. We're going to keep it simple here with pandas. So let's start by importing OS. Let's start by importing pandas SPD, and then also import from Flask with an uppercase F, request, and render template. So we're going to keep it extremely simple for the endpoints. We're going to have an index endpoint, an endpoint A, and an endpoint B. And those are just going to have basic HTML files with a heading. So it's just going to be basically 3 hello world endpoints. And we do that just so we have different endpoints that we can visit. So we're going to start here. We're going to say, or actually, first of all, I need to define the app. The app is going to be Flask and underscore name underscore, and the template directory is going to be templates. So like this, and then the first route is going to be app.route, and we're going to have the basic default route, just slash, and this is going to be our index function, and this index function is going to just return a basic HTML file, which is going to be index.html. We don't have it yet. We're going to have then a templates directory here. So templates is going to contain 3 HTML files and 1 base template. But we're going to do that afterwards. So I'm just going to have this simple endpoint. I'm going to copy it now. And we're going to say app route / A is going to be another endpoint. We're going to call this endpoint underscore A. And it's actually just endpoint A HTML. So nothing fancy, just a basic endpoint. And we're going to do the same thing here with endpoint B. All right, so that's really whatever you like. You can have different endpoints. You can have functional endpoints here. Those are representing your endpoints in your actual Flask application. This could be a to-do list. You would have something like inspect to do, edit to do, stuff like that. Just different to do, just different endpoints. And now we want to have also a time tracking endpoint. So we're going to say here also app.route, and the endpoint is going to be /track time, for example. And track time is going to have methods equal to, to post. So this is going to be an endpoint that takes post requests. And we're going to say here def track time. So the function is going to do the following thing. Now, usually when we get a post request from a form, what we do to get the individual fields is we say request.form, and then we access the individual fields. Now, since we're not sending a form this time, but we're sending a beacon, we need to access something else. We need to access request.json. So we get a JSON object from the beacon, And this JSON object will contain two fields. This is just how we define it. You can include whatever you want, but we're going to do it like that in the front end. In the JavaScript code later on, we're going to send two pieces of information, the endpoint, so the actual endpoint that we're currently at, and the time spent. So we're going to expect this JSON object that we get here from the post request to include endpoint, and we also wanted to include request JSON. We also wanted to include the time. And we're then going to store this in variables. So endpoint equals request JSON endpoint, time equals request JSON time. This is what we get from the request. Now, all we want to do now is we want to lock this into a file. So we're going to say here if os.path.exist. So if a file tracker.csv already exists, we're going to just add the information to the existing CSV file. So we're going to load the existing file by saying pandas.read CSV. We're going to load the tracker.csv file. We're going to say the index column is going to be the endpoint. And of course, in this case, we don't have user management. We just have one user. If you have multiple users, the only thing that you would have to do is you would also have to include a user element. So when you have something like Flask login and stuff like that, you can get the current user very, very easily. You just have Flask login and then Flask login.current user, and you can also log the user. So you would have user endpoint time, and then you can just easily say, okay, for individual users, handle this. But you can also maybe, even if you have multiple users, just be interested in how much time in general is spent on an endpoint. So you can do it like this as well. But our index column here is going to be endpoint. In the case that you have multiple users, you would also have an identifier to identify the individual columns where you have endpoint and user combinations, because those can be different. You can have multiple user entries, multiple endpoint entries with the same values, but the combination is unique. So in our case, since we only have the tracking in general without the individual user, we're going to just keep track of the endpoint, and this is going to be the identifier of the individual rows. So this is going to be the index column. And then we say if endpoint in df index values. So basically what this does is we check if the endpoint that we're currently logging or tracking the time for, if there is already an entry, or if this endpoint is visited for the first time, since the tracking is active. And if the endpoint is already part of the data frame, we're just going to increase the value. So we're going to say df at, which is at this position, and this uses square brackets. This is not a function. This is something that we can index here. So we're going to say df at, and we're going to say endpoint. So endpoint is the index. This is why we can just pass endpoint here. And we want to access the time column. And for the time column, we want to say plus equals float time spent, or actually time. Maybe we should call this time spent, because time is actually a Python module. And if we need it, this would be a name conflict. So at the point where the endpoint is the endpoint, so the index of the data frame is the endpoint, at this point, take the time and increase it by the time that we got from the request. Otherwise, if the endpoint does not occur in the data frame yet, we're going to create a new entry. We're going to say df location, so df log endpoint is going to be the time spent, or actually the float time spent. All right, so that is if the file already exists. Now, if the file does not exist at all, we didn't track anything yet, we're going to create a new CSV file. We're going to say pd data frame. The data frame is going to have the columns just time. Why just time? Why not endpoint? Because endpoint is going to be the index. It's not going to be a column. So we're going to say df log endpoint is going to be equal to time spent. That is going to be the index. So when we do .log, we're actually talking about the index. And then we're going to say here now df to CSV in the end, and we're going to say tracker.csv index equals true. So the index is also written to the CSV file. And the important thing now is, since we didn't define any point here that the endpoint is actually called endpoint, we need to do it here now when we write to the CSV file. So index label is going to be endpoint, so that we can then, of course, when we load it the next time, also know that the index column is endpoint, because we exported it as endpoint. And then you can return something. I think the Flask endpoint should always return something. Otherwise, there's a problem. I'm just going to return an empty string here. Yeah, actually, it would probably be more useful to return something with a status code, maybe an empty JSON object or something. But it's okay. We're just going to return an empty string for now. That is the time tracking endpoint. Now we need to access this endpoint. We need to send beacons to this endpoint in the front end. So we're going to talk now about the HTML files. And the basic idea here is to have a base HTML template, and then all the endpoints are going to inherit from it, so we don't have to include the same JavaScript code into every single endpoint. We can just say that the base template applies to all the individual endpoints, and there we have the JavaScript code. So we're going to say here base HTML, and the base HTML is just going to be an ordinary HTML file. We're going to say here time tracking app is going to be the title. And what we want to do here now is we want to have a script. We're going to write the script in a second here. We're just going to leave it empty for now. The important thing is that in our HTML file here, we need to specify a section where other content is going to be loaded in. So we're going to have the endpoint HTML files, which are going to inherit this template, and then they need to have a section where they can include their own content. And for this, we're going to say here curly brackets, %% block and content, and then we're going to say here end block. The basic idea is that the base template will always be the same, but the pages, the individual other HTML files, will differ in what they insert here. So above that, we're going to also have a simple navigation. We're going to just say here navigation. We're going to have an unordered list. And in that list, we're going to have links. So href or ahref is going to be, and then we're going to use just URL4 here. So we're going to say URL. Since I didn't set this to be a Flask application in the settings, it doesn't recognize that I'm using Jinja template encode here. But we're going to say URL4, and we're going to say index. Now, when you use URL4, you need to specify the function names. So not a, but endpoint a. Not slash, but index. So if I say URL for index, it's going to get me to this endpoint here. So URL for index is going to be the href. We're going to have the closing tag here. We're going to have in between here a list item. And here we're going to have the text index. Right, so we can copy this now. We can change this to endpoint A, endpoint B, A, B, and I hope this is okay. Maybe we should have the A inside of the list item, but we're gonna just keep it like that now. And that is basically the page. Now for the script, for the time tracking script, or maybe before I do that, let me just show you how we can inherit in the other HTML file. So we're gonna say index.html here. And instead of having this whole structure here, we're going to delete this. And all we're going to do now is we're going to say that this extends from the base template. So we're going to say extends, and then in quotations here, base.html, and then % again. And then we're going to define that we want to insert into the block content, that we want to have specific content in there, and this is going to be in our case here, hello world, this is the index. Like this. So basically taking whatever we have here and then putting this in addition to the code that we have here into this section. And then we can copy this now. We can paste it. We can call this a.html or endpoint a.html, and we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to say this is the endpoint A. Then we can copy this. We can paste this. We can change the name to endpoint B and the code here to endpoint B as well. That is basically it. Now the whole magic is going to happen in the base template. So here, and this is going to be JavaScript code. So this is going to be the actual beacon sending here. And the logic is actually quite simple. First of all, we're going to define it. This is text JavaScript. The logic is simple. The first thing we want to do is when we go to the page or to any page here that extends from base HTML, we want to define the current time. So the start time is going to be equal to date dot now. So this gives us the current timestamp, the current point in time. Then we're going to add a so-called event listener. So we're going to say window.add event listener. And the event listener is going to listen for an event called before unload. So this is a name that you have to write exactly like this, before unload, meaning before you unload the page, when you change to a different location, when you close it, whenever you unload the page, before you do that, it's going to call the following function. And this function is now going to be our tracking function. I'm going to say function here. And this function will do the following thing. It will define the end time. So end time is going to also be date.now. Now, the important thing is this is executed when you go to the page. This is executed when you leave the page. So this is going to be the start time. This is going to be the end time. And then we can calculate the time spent. The time spent is just going to be end time minus start time. And then what we want to do is we want to define here the URL of our tracking endpoint. This is something that we're going to do again with URL for. And what we're actually looking for here is time. Actually, we need double quotations here to be able to use single quotations inside. So time underscore tracking, or actually, what was it? It was track time, not time tracking, track underscore time. And this URL, to this URL, we're going to send a beacon. And first of all, we're going to define the data that we want to send to that beacon. So we're going to say new blob. And I'm not entirely sure about that, but I think blob stands for binary large object or byte large object, something like this. And this is going to be a list. And in this list, we're going to have json.stringify. And here we're going to pass a dictionary. And this dictionary will be endpoint is the key. And the value here of the endpoint is going to be the current location. So window location path name. This will just take the URL at the top. And then we're also going to have the key time, which is going to have the value time spent that we calculated up here. And then basically after all of this, after the list, we need to specify another dictionary here, which is going to specify the type of the content. And this type is going to be application/JSON. Then a semicolon. And in the end, once all of this is done, we're going to say navigator.sendBeacon to the URL with the data. So if I didn't make any mistakes, this is the whole logic here. We just wait for the page to unload. We calculate the time difference here. We define the data object, and then we send it as a beacon to this endpoint, and this will log it into a CSV file. So the only thing left here now is to run the application. So we're going to say here if underscore underscore name underscore underscore equals main underscore underscore. Then we're going to say app.run debug equals true. And now I can run this. I can visit the website here. You can see I'm in the index. You can see I have endpoint A, endpoint B. And I can change around here. And now I also have the tracker CSV file. And you can see I have the endpoint / A/B. And you can see how much time I already spent on these endpoints. Now, those are milliseconds. So this is roughly 2 to 3 seconds. This is 1 second, 1 second. And right now, where am I actually? Right now, I'm on the index. So I'm spending a lot of time on the index, which means that when I change here to B, the index will have increased a lot. So now I'm on B. I can chill here for a couple of seconds, and then I can change to index again. And then you can see that the time for B increased. And this can also, again, as I said, be done for different users. The only difference would be that you also have to keep track of the users. So you have to, where is it? In the backend, you have to also say, okay, what user is this request coming from? And you have to say Flask login current user, and then you would have to log the user value here as well. But this is how you build a simple analytics time tracking feature into your Flask application using beacons. So that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and hope you learned something. If so, let me know by hitting a like button and leaving a comment in the comment section down below. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell to not miss a single future video for free. Other than that, thank you much for watching. See you in the next video, and bye.